So happy to be here with all of you. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Katie Baird-Nalvin. I'm the program manager for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. I've been with the collaborative since April, and I'm just thrilled to be in this role. It is so much fun to work here in the local community with all of you. And I'd also love to introduce Jamie Kish. Jamie is our program associate. Lots of you know her as lots of people know you, Jamie. She's been leading tide pool tours for us, and she's a photographer in the area. She does all sorts of wonderful things, so we're happy to have her on our team as well. I'd like to take a moment and just, thank everybody for being here. Thank all of our tabling partners we have in the room. Also thank our sponsors that are here tonight. We have a lot of this event is supported by the Oregon Community Foundation, Portland Autobahn, local champion Paul Englemeyer, he's around here somewhere, Surfrider, the City of Yachats, and the Oregon Coast Visitors Association, also known as OCVA, if that name rings a bell. OCVA supports us in so many different ways, including our Tide Pool Ambassador program that Jamie and Liz back there both guide for in the summers. They also help out with other projects like our video field trip series. And they're providing all the wonderful catering that we have here tonight in the kitchen. So a huge shout out to everybody there. Yeah, let's give it up for them. Yeah, we have Mandala Catering providing all the food here to represent give it up for Boone back there. Yeah, all along here on the Central Coast Food Trail. So big shout out to the vendors represented here, Ona Restaurant, Drift Inn, Yachats Brewing, Bread and Roses, and Still Wagon Distillery. We're all thrilled to have them here tonight. And big shout out to OCVA too, who's just working to make it easier to find and buy local sustainable seafood like the delicious shrimp that we'll be eating here tonight in a little bit. Yeah, we're gonna be eating shrimp. This is a cool event, right? Yeah. So just so we get a sense of who's in the room, throw your hand up if this is your first Land Sea Symposium. Oh my gosh. Okay, me too, actually. So thank you so much for being here. If you live locally, awesome, love to see it. Anybody travel from a distance from like the valley? Cool. Anybody travel further, like from Portland or something? Yeah. Great. And I also want to say hello to all of our folks that are tuning in virtually on Zoom. We're happy to have you participating virtually as well. I just want to let you know that the agenda, it's posted on these posters around the room. It's also here behind me, and it can also be seen on our website at any moment. So with that, I'd like to just do a brief introduction to the Cape Perpetua Collaborative and tell you all a little bit about the amazing work that we're doing. So like I said, I'll just go over the agenda here briefly tonight. We're at this introduction to the Cape Perpetua Collaborative part. And then we're going to be hearing a welcome address from Yachats City Council President Ann Stott, as well as Representative Gomberg. We're thrilled to have them here tonight. The mayor of Waldport also would like to be here this evening, but he had some personal matters come up and sent his regrets, but he's really looking forward to working with us in the future. And then we're going to play a great video in celebration of the 10 years of Oregon's Marine Reserves. And then we're going to hear from our keynote speakers, Cristen Don and Dr. Will White. And then we're going to have some partner introductions. We're going to bring up Joe from Portland Autobahn for that. And then we're going to get to our social mixer with more food and drink and shrimp. And then we're going to have our panel discussion moderated by Charlie with Surfrider, and then we'll get back to some food and drink before we all just say good night for the evening. So again, we're so glad to have you here. Let's see.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to talk to you real quick about the Cape Perpetua Collaborative that we've got here. Cape Perpetual Collaborative's vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within the local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, stewardship from the land and sea in and around the Cape Perpetual Marine Reserve area. Underneath here, you'll notice a bunch of fantastic organizations. We've been working with these organizations since 2007, and they've been instrumental in helping the collaborative get to where we are today. Ooh. So yeah. Okay. There we go. Yay. Awesome. So I'm going to just real quick run through some of our programs. We have our marine debris surveys that we run out of Cape Cove once a month, and we clean up a bunch of marine debris and microplastics. We have our sea star wasting disease surveys throughout the summer months. We have our BioBlitz series with folks like Paul Englemeyer, who works with the marbled murrelets. We also have the BioBlitz series with myself, which is the fungi BioBlitz, and we just wrapped those up for the year and saw a good amount of fungi species all around the Cape that we documented. We also have our shorebird monitoring sessions. We have our ambassador programs, including tide pool ambassador programs, which myself and Liz work at, as well as our Marine Reserve Ambassador Program, which is held at Smelt Sands throughout the warmer months. So those are just some of our programs that we have going year-round, and we're always looking for volunteers if you would like to participate, or just come out and join us on a program. Clicker. Cool. So as far as upcoming events that we have, you can always head on over to our website at capeperpetualcollaborative.org. Some really neat things coming up in the few weekends ahead. We have Jenny Coaster from ODF&W, who's also has a table right behind us out here. She's going to be here all night, so you can go over, talk to her. She'll also be giving a presentation on ocean acidification and hypoxia this Saturday at 2 p.m. at the Cape Perpetual Visitor Center. So come on over and listen to that. We have Josh McInnes coming over to talk about killer whale ecology and behaviors. And Dave Muerter talking about Yachats geology, and Dave is also a wonderful volunteer of ours. So definitely come over and hear about that. Our friends over at the Siletz Confederated Tribe are throwing their 45th annual restoration powwow on the 19th at 6 p.m. is when it'll start, so I highly recommend going to check that out. It's bound to be a fantastic time. And lastly, we have a few more things coming down the pipeline. Our Young Scientists and Wavemaker webinars are coming up. So once the winter speaker series wrap up, we'll be having younger folks like Helena and Fiona, who are high school students who have filmed a documentary called Kelp Me Please. They're going to be coming down, we're going to have a webinar hosting them that you can tune into, as well as Zach Muner, who will be talking about sea star wasting disease, and Raquel Gilliand, who will be talking about harmful algal blooms off our coastline. So make sure to tune into all those. We'll have them all up on our event page, where you can just log in or just sign up and then attend any of these awesome talks. And we have a lot more awesome stuff coming soon, so get ready. And keep checking on our website. That's where we have a lot of this stuff posted all the time. That was really bright. Woo! Yeah, go. That is so bright.
Again, thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to point out that our collaborative relies heavily on community support and donations, and a great way to support us is purchasing our merchandise like Jamie and I are wearing here. You can see samples of the shirts over at Liz's table back there. She had them out, and you can order them in every size you can imagine and lots of colors on this website here. You can also get on our website to find them. And I mean, who doesn't love big buffs, right? And again, I just want to encourage you all to connect with us. Please follow our social on Facebook. That's how we can stay in contact with a lot of you. Also our website, Cape Perpetua Collaborative. And just email us anytime at that address listed there. There's also the Contact Us button on our website. It just goes to us. It doesn't go anywhere else, just to our faces. We'll get back to you as soon as we can, we promise. And, with that, I just also, again, so much gratitude for you all being here tonight. We recognize that being part of the younger crowd, we owe it to a lot of you who advocated for the Marine Reserves 10 years ago to make this all happen. So we're also here celebrating all your efforts this evening as well. So with that, I would love to bring up Yachats City Council President Ann Stott to say a few words.
I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the City of Yachats. I have to admit, I've been a councilor now for 2 years, and this is the first public event that I've got to welcome you to. Last weekend, we had our great our Celtic Music Festival that I think kind of signaled to the world that we're back, we're open for business, and this symposium is just kind of following that right up to show how vibrant the community of Yachats is. When I was asked to do this, and I thought a little bit about what to say, first thing I had to do was go to their website and see what they do. And right off the bat, all I had to do was read the first few words you see on their website. Ocean conservation, collaborate, and educate. Simple as that. Ocean conservation. How do we achieve that? We have to work together. We have to collaborate. And once you've got your partners, then what do you got to do? You got to go out and educate all the rest of us folks who don't really have a clue what's going on in that ocean. I grew up, and until I was 57 years old, I lived in landlocked Utah. And I had the experience of finally seeing the Pacific Ocean when I was 17. And from that point on, I made sure to visit on a regular basis. I was a school teacher, hence the education part of that mission. I'm very excited to see organizations like the Cape Perpetua, whatever we are, collaborative. See, look, I already forgot what we are doing. It is so important because as someone who really doesn't know a lot about the ocean, other than that I really like the waves, and I've really had fun collecting agates and other rocks, and the tide pools are just amazing. But what you come to realize is when you walk on the beaches and you see the little pieces of plastic, and you just cringe. And that's what first happened to me when I moved here 5 years ago. As I got out on my happy beaches and I see what man has done. And the only way we can ever help our oceans recover is through educating our public. You guys already get it. You're here. Okay, that's important. What happens beyond here becomes even more important because it's up to those of you that know right now the value of our ocean and the marine life and the biology and all of that stuff. You know how important that is. You got to make sure that you're not only talking to the choir, okay? Because the choir also gets your message. When we talk about educating the public, it's that large group out there that doesn't get it. And so it's a major undertaking. And I love to hear Katie use the phrase, we appreciate what some of you, what did you call them, older, younger? You called yourselves younger, so you appreciated what the mature people have accomplished, okay? Guys, the the reserves have been here now for 10 years. That is a huge accomplishment to have done that. Now we have this great, enthusiastic group of young people leading the education and the preserving, and that is so important. So please recognize the importance of the education part of the mission. I also, when I went and checked out the website, the activities that they offer, and Jamie and Marie just started to touch on them. There are so many amazing activities for young people particularly, and that's how you really change what happens in this country, is educating our youth. I have one problem though. Where's Jamie? I have a problem. You run these wonderful tide pool things. What time do those start?
7 a.m., baby.
I haven't quite figured out how to get the ocean to cooperate and get that tide, low tide, those minus tides that are so awesome. Could you get them at 2 in the afternoon? Work on that, Jamie. Okay. Guys, the website is amazing. There are many great activities. The last thing I want to say is those few words on the website says, Oregon doesn't stop at the beach. Well, I think you need to change this. It needs to say, Oregon starts at the beach. And I leave that with you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful to hear from you. I would now like to welcome up Representative Gomberg. Representative Gomberg represents House District 10, which after redistricting now includes the entirety of Lincoln County and has boundaries that stretch from Lincoln City to Junction City and from Florence to Philomath. His legislative efforts have focused on small business, disaster recovery, community resilience, government efficiency, environmental stability, and ensuring independence and dignity for seniors. Please welcome up Representative Gomberg.
Well, hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you here, and it's so wonderful to be here tonight in my district. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? I hope you're as pleased as I am that with the district changes, that now that Yachats is part of the 10th district and Cape Perpetua is part of the 10th district, which of course means that now 3 of our 5 marine reserves are offshore of the 10th district where Oregon begins. I'm so delighted to be with you and to be here in person to see all of you. I wanted to see the hands once again of those people here for the first time. Wow. Welcome to an exciting evening. And give me just a moment and bear with me, because I'd like to see anybody who's been to at least 5 of our Land and Sea Symposiums to stand up. Could you do that? Stand up if you've been to at least 5. Go ahead, stand up, stretch your legs. Okay, I'm seeing some people on their feet now. All right, now if you've only been to 4, you can sit down, but if you've been to 4 or more, stay standing. All right, come on, bear with me. Nobody sat down. All right, so if you've been to 4, now sit down unless you've been to 3. Oh, Paul sat down, look at that. 3, how about 2? Stay standing if you've been to 2. And finally, if you've just been to 1, have you been to all 10 of them? That's what I'm trying to say. Have you been to all 10? I got that completely wrong, didn't I? Let's start over. Stand up if you've been to 5 or more. 6. All right. I want to know who's been to all 10 of them. Who's been to all 10? There we have it. Wow. I used to do that so well. It just feels like you come out of the campaign season and you're at the top of your game, and then they have the election and everything changes. By the way, have you read that we had an election last week? let me talk for a moment or two about the election last week. And first of all, let me say how very proud I am to have been reelected in this wonderful district. And for your resounding support. I mean, Lincoln County, 60% support for me here in Lincoln County. Now, I know that there's people in the room that are Democrats, that are people in the room that are Republicans, there are people that are in other parties or no party at all, but I wanted to give you some context tonight. I am the only elected Democrat now on the entire Oregon coast. Yeah. And so that presents some unique challenges when the Coastal Caucus gathers, which of course are those legislators representing coastal districts, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, senators or representatives, that I'm the only Democrat in the room. Now, this is a group that has worked really hard to work collaboratively, to work together, to work by consensus. And I think that we have done that with a great deal of success. They had a meeting last week, and I'm not sure how to take this, but they asked me once again to chair the Coastal Caucus. Now, I don't believe they did that because they hold me in such high regard. I believe that they did that possibly for some strategic reasons, because there are Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature, but also because we need to maintain that balance. And sometimes, putting somebody who's a minority in the room, but in the majority party in the Capitol in charge of the group gives us some particular kind of entree. But I wanted to signal to you that for whatever reason they made the decision, they did make the decision to ask me to remain as chair. And I think that's a reflection on the caucus and their desire to continue to operate on a bipartisan basis. Now, there's something else, because if you read the news reports about this last election, you saw that after spending hundreds of millions of dollars and so much time and energy, that aside from some bruised egos and some fractured relationships, at the end of the day, not that much changed. Not that much changed. A couple of seats in the Senate, a couple of seats in the House, but the Democrats retained the governor's position, and they retained a solid majority in both the House and the Senate. So that's what the headline says, but I want to dig a little bit deeper with you tonight. Forgive me for delving off into politics, but everything that you're concerned about around this room tonight is at some point going to come down to politics. Where I serve in the House, first of all, let me tell you that a third of the members of the House are brand new. A third are brand new. And last election, a third were brand new as well. Now, keep in mind what the last 2 years have looked like. That means that over the last 2 years, I haven't sat across the lunch table from any of my new colleagues. We haven't built those important relationships. We haven't shared ideas face to face on priorities or concerns or on policy. 2/3 of the people who are going to be serving you in the Oregon legislature next year have not gone through what I would call a regular legislative session. Now, think of your own organizations. If 2/3 of the members were brand new, I mean, that would provide you with some opportunities and some great potential, but that'd also mean the loss of expertise and historical knowledge and understanding of the process. And so there's a loss of efficiency, and the legislature is going to be facing that. The other thing that I think is significant about this latest election is that while the Democrats retained their majority, I could hardly call it a mandate. I would say it was not a mandate. The Governor-elect Kotek won by 3%, but certainly far short of a 50% majority. And if you look at the 35 members in the Oregon House that are Democrats right now, the 5 of them that make up the difference between being in the majority or the minority collectively won by less than 2,000 votes statewide. I mean, we're talking people that won by 120 votes, 200 votes, 300 votes. The 5 of them combined, less than 2,000 votes. So I would say that we're in the majority, but we don't have a mandate. And that's going to have a significant effect when we reconvene in January for the next long legislative session. Now, if I'm talking a foreign language to you, let me say that here in Oregon, we meet every year. We meet in even-numbered years, like this past year, for a 1-month-long short session. And we meet in odd-numbered years, like the coming year, for a long session where we meet for 6 months, and we write a 2-year budget, and we deal with legislation. So we're going to be sitting down, and we're going to be talking about the 10-year review of our Oregon Marine Reserves. That's on the agenda for the coming session. We're going to be talking about marine-based economies, the blue economy, and the kind of jobs that come out of our ocean, whether they're fishing or research or manufacturing or repairs. We're going to be talking about the marine economy. We're going to be talking about seismic resilience and better preparing our Oregon coast for a major seismic event that may happen in our lifetimes, but assuredly will happen at least in our kids' and grandchildren's lifetime. And we're going to be talking about wind energy. Boy, don't think for a minute that the wind energy conversation is a simple one. Because while I think everybody here likes the idea of renewable energy, we also have to talk about the unintended consequences and the side effects. What are the potential impacts on existing economies here on the coast, like our fishing fleet, who are interested in using the same areas that the federal government says we should be building wind platforms? And what is the impact on our marine wildlife and our marine chemistry and the California current, the upwelling, and on and on and on, to things that are as obscure to me as possibly affecting marine navigation by interrupting their radar or interrupting the migration patterns of our whales off the coast. So there's a lot going on in wind energy, and it's going to be a very complicated, complex, and potentially contentious conversation. The final thing I wanted to share with you is I'm going to be having dinner tomorrow night with our state treasurer, Tobias Reed, here in the district, and he has just unveiled a bold proposal to remove investments by Oregon's pension fund in fossil fuels. Now, believe it or not, our state treasurer doesn't have the unilateral authority to do that. He's got to work with the Oregon Investment Board and a lot of other groups that are looking over their shoulder, helping make those investment decisions. But he's standing up and taking a firm lead, saying that the $90 billion that we have in our pension funds here in Oregon can be better invested than in fossil fuels and still retain the earnings that our retirees deserve and are looking forward to. So there's a lot going on. I look forward to being involved in those conversations. I look forward to working with you on those conversations. And I hope that you'll continue to be communicating with me. Let me know when you think I'm on the right track. Let me know when you think I'm on the wrong track. I hope everybody here is subscribing to my weekly newsletters. And if you're not, just go to my legislative webpage. I'm not hard to find. Click on the box that says I want the newsletter. If you read one or two of them and think they're a waste of time, and then click on the box at the bottom that says take me off the list. But I hope that you'll take advantage of those. And as long as we're ahead of schedule, I wanted to share one more thing with you that I think is just remarkable. And it's not about the beach, it's not about the ocean, it's about us and our history and our culture and we as Oregonians. Because on Saturday, I'm going to be coming back down from Otis to Waldport. And we're going to be unveiling a statue in Waldport of a remarkable Oregonian, an Oregon pioneer, a man who fought and was wounded in the Oregon militia. He operated a ferry in the Waldport area. He owned land there and donated part of his land to for the first school in that area, and served on the school board when they built that school. And was rather infamous for participating in a local election when the storms were so bad that he was the only one that showed up to vote by taking his ferry across the river and participating in the elections. And those stories alone would make Louis Southworth a remarkable Oregonian, but there's more to the story, and that is that Louis Southworth was a black man who was brought to Oregon as a slave. He came here as a slave. He earned his freedom by playing his fiddle and getting enough money together to purchase his freedom. At that time, $1,000, which in current dollars is about $35,000 to purchase his freedom, his inalienable rights. And at a time when the Oregon Constitution said that black people couldn't live here, was embraced in this community and lived here from, I think, 1870 to about 1910, if I'm not mistaken, and then moved to Corvallis and was appreciated so much by that community that when he was in failing health and failing finances, his neighbors got together and paid off his mortgage. So a remarkable story. And where'd Jesse go? Jesse Nolan is back there still sampling the beer and making sure it's cold enough for all of you, but has... Well, I just wanted to, I wanted to give him a shout out for really leading the way on bringing this story to the forefront and bringing the funds together to create this remarkable bronze statue.
But also, he's also running behind the scenes to go get a pizza cutter because they
Not only did he arrange for this wonderful statue, but he's getting you a pizza cutter too. There's a guy. So the unveiling of the Southworth statue in Waldport, I think it's at 1 o'clock at the Welcome Center at the base of the bridge, and it will then be placed permanently at the entrance to the park, a 12-acre park that the high school used to stand on and now has been turned into public space. So a story I think that we can all be very, very proud of, and thanks for letting me take a couple of minutes to tell you about it.
Thank you so much, Representative Gomberg. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for all that you've shared with us this evening. Also, if you're not on Representative Gomberg's newsletter list, you got to get there. It's the best on the coast. Highly recommend, 10 out of 10. Well, so without further ado, we have a video that we'd like to share with you. It's a quick one, and it's celebrating 10 years of Oregon's marine reserves. And this video was produced by the Oregon Marine Reserves Partnership. And we'll just enjoy this video and then hand it on over to our keynotes.
10 years into the Marine Reserves Project, I'm excited about how far we've come, and I'm excited where our program is going to go. We have the building blocks in place to start learning about resilience.
Oregon's marine reserves prohibit the taking of any living thing as well as ocean development.
They're for conservation of biodiversity, they're to focus on research that's relevant to other nearshore management, and they're places that are supposed to focus on communities. They're living laboratories, so to speak, where we can go and learn more about the different communities, their change over time. We also get to learn about the human communities and how they use and rely on these natural resources.
I use marine reserves as if they're the weather stations of the sea. I go out and we deploy instruments that continue to measure changes in ocean conditions, be it the ocean currents, the salinity, the temperature, or the amount of oxygen in it, even when we're not there. And every summer we go out, we deploy the sensors, we download the data, and we bring them back just to see, what's happening this year. Are changes bigger or smaller than we expected?
Oregon has 5 marine reserves down its coast.
I was fortunate enough to work with the great people that helped create this Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve off of Port Orford. Right behind us at Redfish Rocks, we have one of the best fish incubators in the ocean in Southwest Oregon.
The one that I work in the most, it's the Cape Petro Marine Reserve. It has the longest record of ocean oxygen conditions of any marine reserve on the West Coast and probably nationally.
As we move further north up to the Otter Rock Marine Reserve, this is our shallowest marine reserve site. And so it means it's actually a really great place to find intertidal diversity of algae and seagrasses. It's our most accessible site, so that means it's great for exploring tide pools. If we move further up to the Cascade Head Marine Reserve, we're learning in some of our ecological studies that subtidal sea stars have different responses to sea star wasting disease.
The Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is incredibly special. It's the northernmost of Oregon's 5 marine reserves. And one thing that makes it unique is it's actually in the Columbia River plume, which is a ginormous river with a lot of effect both on the land and ocean of Oregon. And there's a lot of wildlife interactions between the ocean and that Columbia River estuary. The other amazing thing about Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is its land-sea connection. It's adjacent to Oswald West State Park, and it's also adjacent to 2 new conservation areas totaling 5,000 acres just to the south.
Before the Marine Reserves program, we had these different snapshots of different projects that happened in different places up and down the coast that were very specialized about a particular topic. And the Marine Reserves program has been able to help us get a bigger picture, not just what's happening in that snapshot of time, but really what's happening through the years and with multiple components of the ecosystem to help us build this better picture of what's happening in our nearshore oceans, what resources are there, what's the normal change that we see, and what's different, what's cause for alarm, and what can we do about it.
We're also realizing that the system of marine reserves that we have off the Oregon coast, we didn't put all of our eggs in the same basket. Some are to the north, some are to the south, and they coincide with different neighborhoods where the ocean conditions are different. So some are going to be more at risk from future climate change, and others might actually be refuges that we can rely on. When a system is protected, we give it a chance. We give it a chance to be more resilient, to grow that ability to rebound from changes that might be a marine heat wave or a low oxygen event.
Redfish Rocks in particular is a really special marine reserve to me because so many diverse community members came together to make this happen and then to also make it really great for the community.
One of my favorite things to do in the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve is experience it with my 6-year-old son. Having this conservation area really adds to its beauty and its story. So we really enjoy tide pooling and boogie boarding and just running through the waves. And every time we experience the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve, the beach and the nearshore ocean, we're learning together about our ocean. Oregon's marine reserves really give us a connection to our ocean in a way that we've never had before.
It's just been a wonderful opportunity to work with all the great people and the stakeholders in creating this marine reserve, and we got this fish incubator for all of our fishers to enjoy for generations to come.
Thank you. Thanks for that video. It's great. So glad that we were able to show it here tonight. I would now like to invite up our first keynote speaker, Cristen Don. Cristen has led the ODFW Marine Reserves program from the program's inception in 2009 until June of this year. She was involved in the Marine Reserves planning process and has worked in a variety of other nearshore management topics like fisheries management and wave energy planning. Cristen recently stepped away as program lead for the ODFW Marine Reserves program, but continues to support the program at ODFW and is excited to watch the program in its next phase. Please join me in welcoming up Cristen.
Just pop it out. All right. Thank you. It's so good to be back at the Land Sea Symposium this year. Oregon's Marine Reserves Program is the first long-term nearshore conservation and monitoring program implemented by the state of Oregon. It's currently the only ecosystem-focused ecological monitoring program that's designed to track and understand changes occurring in our ocean waters here in Oregon state waters. And it's the first comprehensive human dimensions research program ever to focus on looking at examining social, economic, and cultural dynamics of the Oregon coast and coastal communities. So in that vein of firsts, we're here tonight to celebrate.
Yeah! Excellent tech support by Bree. Thank you very much.
So in that vein tonight, we are here to celebrate what we've accomplished over the last 10 years of Marine Reserves implementation. And my intent is to highlight and tease you with some of the findings from our 10 years of ecological monitoring and human dimensions research. As a reminder, Oregon created these marine reserves to conserve marine habitats and biodiversity. They serve as scientific reference sites for us to learn more about marine reserve protections here in Oregon, but also just to learn more about Oregon's nearshore marine ecosystem. And the idea is what we're learning is used to support nearshore management decisions here in Oregon. And then the unique goal to Oregon is that the reserves are to avoid significant negative impacts to ocean users and coastal communities. All right, so Oregon has 5 marine reserve sites, as you saw in the video. These are all located within Oregon's state waters. That means they're all within 3 nautical miles of shore. And each of the sites has at its core a marine reserve. And this is where there's no extractive activities allowed. So there's no fishing or ocean development allowed in the marine reserves. And then most of the sites also have one or more less restrictive marine protected area adjacent to the marine reserve. And in the marine protected areas, all ocean development is prohibited, but each marine protected area allows some level or type of fishing. So the marine reserves constitute 3% of Oregon's state waters, and the marine protected areas an additional 6%. So all 5 sites in total constitute about 9% of Oregon's state waters. So 9% are in protection. Now, to derive at these 5 sites, the planning process was over a decade long. It started back in 2000 at the request of then Governor Kitzhaber. And there were multiple phases to this planning process. And there are many people here tonight who are involved in that process. And I just want to say thank you. And we survived. It was quite an accomplishment. But it was multiple phases, and it involved local community members working with state decision makers to site marine reserves in areas that would provide ecological benefits while also avoiding significant negative impacts to ocean users and coastal communities. And the harvest restrictions at each of these sites was phased in over time. So they were phased in between 2012 and then our newest and last marine reserve at Cape Falcon just began harvest restrictions in 2016. So the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the lead agency responsible for management and scientific monitoring of the sites, and we share management responsibilities with Oregon State Parks, Department of State Lands, and then Oregon State Police actually does all the enforcement of the marine reserves. And then we are so fortunate to work with so many collaborators, including the Cape Perpetua Collaborative, to implement many aspects of the marine reserves. We rely on these collaborators to bring additional expertise, to bring additional funding, to bring additional staff and volunteers, and there is absolutely no way this program would be a success without these collaborators. The state legislature has allocated 6 full-time permanent staff to ODFW that are focused on marine reserves implementation, and we have a biennial budget of approximately $1.8 million. Now, marine reserves legislation passed back in 2012 stated that there needs to be a program check-in and a report due to the legislature on the program in early 2023. That's next year. Some of us can't believe it's already here. But as part of that process, last year in 2021, the ODFW Marine Reserves team and our collaborators focused on developing the Oregon Marine Reserves Program Synthesis Report. This is a comprehensive report looking at the ODFW Marine Reserves Program and reporting on the first 10 years of Marine Reserves implementation. Now, along with this 160-page report are a large number of very technical appendices that dive really deep into our ecological monitoring data and our human dimensions research data. We handed this report and all the supplemental documents over to Dr. Will White, who's leading a university team who's doing a formal assessment of our program, and then we'll be delivering a report to the legislature early next year. And so Will is going to be talking about that assessment here in his presentation after mine. Okay, so what do we have after 10 years of marine reserves implementation? Well, I'll tell you, doing research in Oregon's nearshore marine waters is pretty difficult. This is cold water, high energy, lots of surge and waves, and underwater visibility is pretty poor. But we now have a suite of research tools that we can reliably collect data on nearshore species, habitats, and communities. We also now have robust data sets that allow us to track and detect future nearshore ocean changes occurring in our state waters. On the human dimension sides, we now have great information about how people are using, value, experience, and depend on Oregon's nearshore ocean. We now have ecological information about how each of the marine reserve sites is unique, whether it's unique species composition or species abundances, or we have information on how different marine reserves are responding differently to environmental stressors, so different responses to sea star wasting disease or low oxygen hypoxia events. Similarly, on the human dimension side, we now have great information on how communities differ from one another, whether it's different coastal communities or whether it's how the coastal population differs in its perspectives and opinions about ocean management and marine reserves compared to the Willamette Valley I-5 corridor residents, or whether it's differences between communities of interest or communities of occupation. We've also made a lot of contributions beyond just marine reserves coming out of our program, whether it's data we've provided to support other management decisions, like data for stock assessments for fisheries management, or information that's helped us better understand some emerging ocean issues that are very important and of high interest to Oregonians, such as sea star wasting disease, hypoxia, ocean acidification. We've also made some advancements in scientific methods for ecological monitoring of marine protected areas around the world, as well as human dimensions research. And we've come up with a suite of science communication tools to keep people informed and keep people engaged in marine reserves implementation. All right, so now I'm going to tease you. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the ecological monitoring, and I'll share with some highlights from some of our research. As I mentioned earlier, our research program is designed to track and understand ocean changes occurring in Oregon state waters. We use 4 core monitoring tools to collect data on fish, invertebrates, algae, habitats, and oceanographic conditions. And these tools include hook and line and long line fishing. We have a remotely operated vehicle that has underwater cameras. We have video landers, which are drop camera systems, and then we have scuba divers. We also have 3 long-term collaborations that are led by academic researchers. These include juvenile fish surveys, rocky intertidal monitoring, and oceanographic monitoring. We started sampling in each of the marine reserve sites 2 years before harvest restrictions took effect, and we're continuing to monitor and collect data on a regular basis. We sample inside the marine reserve and then also outside of the marine reserve in areas that are still open to fishing that we call comparison areas. And the idea is to track changes inside the marine reserve and outside of the reserve over time. And we want to know if those changes are similar inside or outside of the reserve, or are they different. And we're doing this at 14 sites up and down the coast. So our ecological staff of 3 is monitoring at 14 sites, 5 marine reserves and 9 comparison areas. All right, so as I mentioned, our oldest marine reserves started in 2012. They're 10 years old, and our newest one just started in 2016. So this time frame has actually been too short for us to start seeing and detecting ecological changes that might be due to marine reserve protections, but our monitoring program has still been able to detect other nearshore ocean changes occurring off our coast. So I'll tease you with some examples. We'll start with down at Redfish Rocks, our southernmost reserve and one of our oldest reserves that started in 2012. This is a highly rocky habitat area. So this is an example from our scuba surveys. From our scuba surveys, we saw different shifts in abundances to different species after the onset of sea star wasting disease, which hit the Oregon coast, the entire Oregon coast, in the year 2014. So on this graph in the middle is the year 2014 when sea star wasting disease hit. This top graph is showing sunflower sea stars, which both in the marine reserve at Redfish Rocks and the comparison area at Humbug, we saw a decline in abundance over time after sea star wasting disease hit. At that same time, we saw purple urchins increase in abundance after sea star wasting disease. Well, sunflower stars are a main predator of purple urchins, right? So sunflowers went down, purple urchins went up. we also saw an increase in the percent cover of crustose coralline algae. That's this pink algae that's encrusting these rocks, and it's often associated, increases of that associated with increases in purple urchins. So we were successful in being able to document change in Oregon's nearshore, seeing different species respond differently to environmental stressors. These long-term monitoring programs allow us to see those sorts of changes. So here's some underwater video from a scuba diver's perspective of redfish rocks from 2019. This is a China rockfish. We see lots of purple urchins. We're seeing red urchins as well, and we're seeing that pink coralline algae. No sea stars. All right, another example from our backyard here at Cape Perpetua. This is our largest marine reserve. Harvest restrictions took effect in 2014. The habitat in this reserve is dominated mostly by soft sediments and gravel, but there is this very unique, isolated, patchy reef on the outer edge of this reserve. And because it's the only rock habitat anywhere around, this reef actually has pretty high diversity of species found on it. Cape Perpetua has been a hotbed for research for decades. Rocky intertidal monitoring has been happening here by Bruce Menge's lab at Oregon State University for close to 30 years, and then oceanography has been monitored here by PSCO researchers at Oregon State University since 2000. So this is one of the most oceanographically monitored marine protected areas anywhere on the West Coast and anywhere in the country. So here's an example where we paired some of our biological data from our hook and line surveys with some of the oceanographic. This is measuring oxygen at Cape Perpetua in the year 2018. So these dark blue lines and the red line are oxygen levels in the summer of 2018. And any lines dipping below this threshold here are low oxygen or considered hypoxic. When we coupled our hook and line survey days over the oceanographic reading, the oxygen readings, we noted that the low oxygen days coincided with our lowest aggregate catches in our hook and line sampling. So hypoxia is affecting our hook and line sampling data. So again, we're collecting multiple streams of information to help paint a picture and also understand how physical phenomena, environmental stressors are affecting actually our data collection. So here's another example at Cascade Head. Also started in 2014. It has the Siletz Reef Complex in this reserve. This is located off of Lincoln City. So here's an example from our remotely operated vehicle where we noticed that different species of sea stars have responded differently post-sea star wasting disease. So our ROV observations noticed that for species like blood stars, blood stars declined in abundance and density after sea star wasting disease, where other species like the false ochre sea star actually increased in abundance after sea star wasting disease. And then some species like leather stars, there was no change, right? So we're seeing for subtidal sea star species, so these are sea stars that always live underwater, we're seeing different responses or recoveries from sea star wasting disease. So again, long-term monitoring helping us understand changes in the nearshore environment and different responses. And here's just some ROV footage from Cascade Head, this nice high relief rocky reef habitat. We've got some sea stars, lots of sea cucumbers, rockfish. All right, so here's another example. This is from our hook and line surveys looking across 4 different marine reserve sites. And when we do this, we realize each of the marine reserves is protecting different fish communities. Now, all 4 of these sites, black rockfish were the most common and abundant species at each of the sites. But for the other most common species at sites, we see different species assemblages in different numbers. So for instance, this is canary rockfish. We see quite a few at Cape Perpetua, but lesser numbers in the Cascade Head and Redfish Rocks. And it was not a common species at Cape Falcon. Another example is China rockfish, which was only commonly seen in our southernmost reserve at Redfish Rocks. And then you'll notice here, this bar at Cape Falcon's a lot smaller than these other sites. So the abundance, the fish abundance at Cape Falcon is less than at our other 3 marine reserve sites where we do hook and line surveys. Some examples of ways our program has contributed to other management decisions. This is an example. We provided data for the 2019 Cabezon stock assessment. Another example of where we've contributed, we provided data from our scuba surveys that was used in the eventual listing of sunflower stars as endangered by the IUCN. And we currently have a scientific journal publication in review for our findings of the different responses of sea stars at post-sea star wasting disease. All right, so let's take a look a little bit at our human dimensions research. So our research is focused on understanding how regions, communities, and people have been impacted by the marine reserves. And we're doing this through a variety of different social science disciplines with a very large number of outside collaborators. So we work with economists, sociologists, anthropologists, and political scientists to study the reserves and the impacts on people and communities. So our research questions have been, are people knowledgeable about the marine reserves? What are the public's attitudes about the marine reserves? What are the economic impacts on fishermen by the marine reserves? What are the other significant economic impacts on local communities? And what are the social impacts of the marine reserves? And we want to know, have these changed over time? And we looked at impacts at different scales. So we looked at statewide impacts to see if there were any statewide impacts or at the regional level. But we also looked at communities of place, how they've been impacted, how communities of interest have been impacted, and whether individuals have been impacted. All right, so just to tease you with some of the findings, this is by no means comprehensive, but when we looked at were people knowledgeable about the marine reserves, early on when the marine reserves were first coming on board, our surveys showed that the general public had little knowledge that these reserves existed or were coming on board. But we did note that coastal residents were more aware and knowledgeable than residents who lived in Willamette Valley along the I-5 corridor. But our more recent surveys have shown that awareness has actually been increasing about the marine reserves, and it's been increasing across various groups. Complementary, we've also seen that opposition to the marine reserves has been decreasing with different groups over time. What do people think about the marine reserves? Well, both coastal and Willamette Valley or I-5 corridor residents feel somewhat positive about the existence of the reserves. But we do see differences between coastal residents and Willamette Valley residents. So for example, when asked, are marine reserves beneficial, 85% of I-5 corridor residents responded yes, where only 72 of coastal residents responded yes. And when asked, would an impact on commercial fishing be a bad consequence of marine reserves, only 19% of I-5 corridor residents thought it would be bad, or 40% of coastal residents thought it would be bad. So again, differences between communities. And we also even see differences in communities who live close to a marine reserve versus those that live further away from a marine reserve. We also noted that in the minds of fishers and coastal residents, marine reserves are not divorced from other marine resource management issues, right? It's sort of in the same bucket as fisheries management or renewable energy planning. It's all similar when they're thinking about impacts. An online study conducted by Portland State University that was a public participation GIS survey found that at Cape Perpetua, the three most things that people valued in the Cape Perpetua area were aesthetics, biodiversity, and tide pooling. So what are the economic impacts of marine reserves on fishers? Well, it's complicated. Looking at statewide impacts in a spatial economic model that was built by Shannon Davis from the research group for us, we noted that the marine reserve sites are estimated to represent only less than 1% of the total economic contribution of all Oregon fisheries to the state of Oregon. And if you look at just nearshore fisheries, the marine reserve sites are estimated only to represent between 2.9 and 3.8% of the total economic contribution of nearshore fisheries to the state of Oregon. So a small impact. And interviews with fishermen corroborate that most fishermen have said that the reserves are not significantly impacting them. However, the reserves are creating uncertainty. They don't know what the future holds and what other management decisions will be affecting them. And this uncertainty is making it difficult for them to make decisions about their business and the future. We also noted that marine reserves didn't cause distrust, but seem to be acting as a flashpoint between different stakeholder groups. And we see that different stakeholders have different opinions about who they think should be legitimately called a stakeholder and who should be allowed to be involved in marine resource management decision-making. So this is important because it provides insights to where relationships need to be sustained, cultivated, or repaired for other management planning purposes. And there's a common concern for the ocean. Both coastal residents and non-coastal residents said that loss of biodiversity, marine debris, ocean acidification, and overfishing and oil and gas exploration were of concern to them. And so I hope I've teased you and that you're interested in finding out more about what we found in our research over the last 10 years. So I just want to quickly tell you where to find more information. Please visit our website. Please subscribe to our monthly electronic newsletter. We have a data dashboard that Ryan, who's in the back tabling back there, built for us for you to explore some of the data from our monitoring over the last 10 years. We have a Flickr site and a YouTube channel. So thank you. Thank you so much for all your support over the last 10 years.
Thank you so much, Cristen, for sharing all that valuable information with us about the reserves over the last 10 years. It's amazing to have her expertise in this room with us this evening. I'd now like to introduce our second keynote speaker of the evening, Dr. Will White. Dr. Will White is an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at OSU, Oregon State University, and he is based in Newport at Hatfield Science Center. Dr. White earned his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2007, studying the ecology of coral reef fish populations. He then did postdoctoral research at the University of California, Davis, and was on the faculty of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. We're lucky to have you out here on the coast, aren't we? Been around all over. He joined Oregon State University in 2017. Dr. White's research group uses mathematical modeling and statistical approaches to answer basic and applied questions in a wide range of study systems, from oyster reefs to kelp forests to sea turtles. He's advised marine policy in California, Oregon, and British Columbia, and was a member of the science advisory team that informed the design of California's network of marine protected areas. Dr. White has published more than 95 peer-reviewed articles, including nearly 30 on the design and adaptive management of protected areas. Most recently, Dr. White led a team of university researchers that conducted the legislatively mandated review of Oregon's marine reserves. Please join me in welcoming up Dr. White.
Thanks very much. And thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the chance to speak to you. Also, thanks to Cristen for a really great rundown of all the hard work that ODFW has done for the past 10 years in promulgating their Marine Reserves program. So I'm going to start just to review things that I missed at the beginning of Kristen's talk, but I assume she talked about this. The sort of timeline of events, of the legislation that enabled the creation of Oregon's Marine Reserves, and subsequently the requirement that ODFW prepare this immense synthesis report in 2021. There was also this requirement that a team led by an Oregon Public University would assess that assessment and make a report to the Oregon legislature assessing the degree to which ODFW's Marine Reserves program had met those legislative mandates, and then also making recommendations for how they could improve the Marine Reserves program going forward. And so I, being a member of Oregon Public University, was selected to lead that assessment. And I would say I didn't do this by myself. I was able to assemble a team of colleagues from around the nation and actually around the world, spanning all the different disciplines that are touched by marine reserves. So everything from oceanography and marine ecology to natural resource economics, environmental sociology, and environmental psychology. So we were able to assess sort of all the different dimensions of the way the Oregon Marine Reserves affect the ecology and the community here in coastal Oregon. So you'll recall that the legislative goals of Oregon's Marine Reserves program were to conserve biodiversity, to advance scientific research, and to avoid significant socioeconomic impacts. And I'm going to just sort of skip to the key finding, the key result, the end of my story, is that our assessment was that yes, absolutely, Oregon's Marine Reserves program did meet those key goals. And they did a great job of documenting all of those goals. I really encourage you to go check out some of those web resources that Cristen talked about, because they're really fantastically organized and so rich in the data that they provided. So yes, both in the design and implementation, ODFW was meeting a lot of those mandates. And so our recommendations were that it's now time for Oregon's Marine Reserves to enter a more mature phase of their life. You know, we spent 10 years with the Marine Reserves program figuring out the best way to study Oregon's coastal ecosystems. You know, it's really hard to get out in the water in some places, and they had to use different tools in different places. They've optimized that now, and it's time to move on and do what we call adaptive management. And I'll talk about that more. In fact, that's mostly what I want to talk to you about, is where we're going in the future, right? There were some details, some nuances that we called out as ways that we could do things better, right? So we need to have the legislator support ongoing monitoring of Oregon's Marine Reserves so we can ensure that those goals are being met. As Cristen mentioned, it's too soon to assess a lot of the goals that we would like to see, and so we need to keep monitoring to make sure we're giving the ecosystem time to respond. And then, especially on the socioeconomic side, there's a need for better guidance from state leadership about what exactly do we want to see these reserves accomplish, and what kind of costs are we really trying to avoid when we put these reserves into place, and are we achieving those, right? So, as I said, the main thing that I'll be talking about today is our recommendation that Oregon move into a phase of adaptive management of reserves. And so I'm going to talk to you about a few key ideas about this, mainly to inform you about our sort of scientific vision for how this management could happen, so that you have the tools to, you know, one member of our coastal caucus is here in the room with us, right, tonight, so that you can talk to your legislators and your representatives to talk about what you'd like to see about happen in Oregon's Marine Reserves. So the key idea behind adaptive management is that it's a cycle, that we make predictions about the way we think a particular management action should happen, what the consequences of that management should be. We then implement that action and monitor the results of that, and then we compare those results to the predictions that we made earlier to see if what we thought would happen. And that lets us either adjust management further to better meet those goals, or maybe reevaluate our assumptions about the way the biology and ecology of the system work. And so I'll talk about each of these elements of the process. I'm going to start by talking about making predictions, and this is really important because we have to set expectations for what reserves can do. What can they do? They can protect habitat, right? The key things that a marine reserve does is it protects the habitat from development and destruction that's directly caused by humans, and it protects the fish and invertebrates and crabs and things from being fished, right? So you get more older and larger fish. The trick is that only really happens if that was a place that was exploited previously, right? If you had a place that was having a lot of fishing happen, then you stop fishing, you get more fish. Sometimes I feel like I'm not like a really fancy scientist because I just say that if you don't catch fish, you get more fish, right? But that's a really important point. That and so this is a diagram from a paper I wrote about 10 years ago, making a quantitative prediction for the level of fishing that you had before a reserve was put into place, translated into what's the relative increase in abundance of that fish population you expect afterwards. And sure enough, and we wrote out equations and things. It's a little bit more complex than this, but the basic idea is that if you don't have a lot of fishing beforehand, the amount of increase you expect to see is much lower than if it was a very heavily fished location. Okay, so that means that and ODFW knows this, right? In fact, they cited a number of my papers in their report, which I was very flattered by. But there's this idea that first of all, the level of exploitation that was happening beforehand affects how much change you expect to see, and it also takes time for these results to develop. You can see the x-axis on this, the horizontal axis is in years, and so these were results for a rockfish population. I think we used numbers for blue rockfish for this, but we're looking at 20 or so years before you realize the full increase, and that. So there's these time lags involved just because the ocean's cold and things grow slowly, right? But another consequence of this is that if you have small changes, they're more difficult to detect because it's easier to measure a difference if you have a big number and a small number than if you have two numbers that are very similar. And so the monitoring that's being done needs to be very robust in order to collect enough data to tell if there are these small changes that might be happening. But furthermore, if we're in a situation, which we are with a lot of the reserves in Oregon, where we chose to minimize impacts on the fishery by placing the reserves in places that weren't heavily fished beforehand, that then affects our expectations for adaptive management, for how much change we can expect to see. We don't expect to see a huge increase in fishes if we weren't fishing there a lot beforehand. Okay, so this led to one of our legislative recommendations, is that adaptive management plan needs to have realistic goals. We need to take into account the different ecologies of the different reserves and the different past histories of those reserves when setting our expectations for what we expect to see happen inside of their boundaries. Okay, the next idea I want to talk to you about is this idea of monitoring. So the Marine Reserves Program has this great ongoing monitoring program. Yeah, just nudge it forward there, if you don't mind. Thanks. Okay, so as Cristen explained, ODFW uses this sort of the gold standard for the way you're supposed to measure the effects, the response of the environment to a management change, which is this before-after control impact concept. So the idea is that we have two locations on the coast. Oh, there we go. And we change something about one of those locations, and then we don't change something about the other. So we make one of these coastal locations a marine reserve and prohibit fishing and other types of ocean development, and we don't change anything in the other one. And then we monitor those two locations going forward, and so we can look at the difference both before and after, and also across the two, and that way we can measure the effect, account for the effects of environmental changes that are large scale that are affecting both of them at the same time, right? The trick is that this really has to be a continuous process. You can't just measure things once and then measure things right before you're about to make a decision about them and call it a day. It has to be ongoing monitoring, and this is an example of why that is. So this is a simulation of a fish population, like a rockfish population, both inside and outside of a marine reserve. And what we've done is simulated what might happen if, like, we have a marine heat wave and we have a lot of mortality in those populations in both locations. Well, that mortality event, even if the marine reserve population in red is increasing relative to the reference population, if you have a big disturbance, it can make both of them decrease and look much more similar to each other than they otherwise would be, even if gradually the reserve will get bigger over time. And so the trick is using the remote, apparently. There we go. It happened eventually. So the trick is you'd want to measure over time to detect not only, what happened, what were things like before, and what are things like much later, but measuring over time so you can be sure that, if you happen to be making decisions around the time that a heat wave had happened, as is sort of the case here, right? We just had this huge multi-year heat wave that caused huge disturbances to our marine ecosystem, that we're aware of that and don't make incorrect decisions about the effectiveness of reserves and the difference inside and outside. Okay, so this led to our recommendation for ongoing funding for ODFW's monitoring so that they're able to get out in the water and keep sampling these marine populations over time and measure these disturbances and understand the way climate is affecting populations and reserves. Okay, and then we come to this idea of evaluating and adjusting, which is in part about comparing those predictions to results, but it's also in part about setting what our priorities are and what we want reserves to accomplish. And so I mentioned one of the goals was to avoid significant socioeconomic impacts, and that's been, I mentioned there's some tension between trying to accomplish conservation goals of protecting marine habitats and avoiding sociological impacts, right? Because if you take away fishing from a location, that's a place you're not fishing anymore, and that comes at a cost to the fishing fleet. The trick is that this is the way the legislative guidance was worded, was in a way kind of vague. It's very difficult to know, what do we mean by a significant result? How much is too much, right? When you talk to a scientist like me and you use the word significance, we tend to think about statistical significance and using probabilities to decide whether something is likely to be true or likely to be a mistake. But that's not really what we mean when we say significant in a legislative context. We're thinking about things that are big or meaningful, right? And so it's really a matter of needing to say, like, how big is a significant impact? And a significant impact on what, right? And so my social science colleagues who worked with me on this report proposed that a better way of thinking about the impacts of any type of policy decision are in this framework of directionality, distribution, and domain. So for any type of action you could take, you could think about the directionality of the effect. Is it a positive or a negative impact, or do things just stay the same? How is that impact distributed over communities, right? Not everybody's going to be affected the same. Not every community is going to be affected in the same way, right? Every marine reserve might have a different effect on nearby communities in Oregon. And then you have to think about the domain. What types of human well-being and human economics were affected? Is this an economic effect, or is it a psychological effect? Does it make us feel bad about things? Right? So as an example, ODFW's Human Dimensions Project, Tommy, collaborated with Portland State University to conduct a survey of the coastal fishing community. And just to summarize the results of the summary, they found that a majority of the respondents said the reserves hadn't had a clear impact on their fisheries participation, which seems really good, right? That's a clear majority where there is no impact, and that would help us minimize that socioeconomic impact. But a third said that the marine reserves had a negative impact, right? Okay, so for those community members, there was a significant negative impact. And if you broke that down, there were distinct types of effects. So some of those fishers found that they were having to move to different fishing grounds. Some were finding that they had to travel further to avoid marine reserves. And some found that they just had more competition. There were more people fishing in the same places, right? So those are sort of distinct impacts. And for any one of those individuals, they might say, yes, there was a significant negative impact of the marine reserves on my business, right? But do we measure that collectively? What's the collective overall impact on the fishing community in the state? How should we break that down? And so this is not a scientific question anymore. This is a public policy question. How do we measure what something is negative or not? And so our recommendation is that in considering where we are with the enabling legislation for the Marine Reserves Program, the legislature should really consider what they mean by what's a significant impact. What type of effects do we need to be thinking about? And what members of the community do we need to be thinking about, and how many things or how many different people need to be affected before we say, yeah, there was a significant negative impact. These economic impacts, though, are also a thing that can change over time, right? So in the work I do looking at the effects of implementing marine reserves, there's often a very immediate negative impact on fisheries because you've taken away fishing from a location. But over time, as fish populations can build up in those locations and produce larvae that can then reseed other fish locations, those negative effects might gradually dwindle. It's also the case that the fishing fleets themselves might change the way they fish in response to those reserves in a positive way. So this is not necessarily a constant, static sort of effect. It can evolve over time too, and also requires ongoing monitoring of the human dimensions of the Marine Reserves Program. I think it worked on the first click that time. Now, looking ahead, as we go to the future of Oregon's marine reserves, if you think about the evolution of marine reserve science, when marine reserves began to become more popular globally and in the United States, sort of in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, the real big concern was about fisheries management. We were bad at fisheries management. We allowed a lot of stocks to collapse. There were collapses of the rockfish fisheries along the West Coast. And we thought we need to have an insurance factor. Like if we could just lock away some populations in these reserves, we will protect ourselves from ourselves. We'll protect the fish from ourselves and bad decisions. And we can enhance fisheries and conserve marine populations. Well, in the intervening time, we've gotten better at fisheries management for one thing, especially here in Oregon, where many of our fisheries are managed with precautionary principles, and we have a lot of data. There's still some data-poor fisheries out there, but we're doing a really, really good job. But this new threat of climate change has really become important, and one of the main threats that we see to a lot of marine populations and marine fisheries are now climate disturbances, like the blob and the heat wave that we had in 2014. And so there's been this hope that, hey, we're putting all these places in marine reserves, maybe those can also help with climate change. Maybe they can provide resilience in some way to these climate disturbances and help us, again, sort of save ourselves from ourselves, right? And so if we think about resilience, I like to joke that when ecologists like me use the word resilience, we could mean any of like 50 different things. But very specifically, if we think about resilience in terms of a population that's at some level and then is disturbed by some kind of environmental force, so like a marine heat wave or a hypoxic event, if we're thinking about like coral reefs, a coral bleaching event, something like that. If it's disturbed, how much is it reduced, and how long does it take to get back to where it was before? So what's that initial impact, and what's that return time or recovery time? And so then we can think about, well, can marine reserves do anything to either reduce the impact of a disturbance or shorten the time it takes to get back to where we were beforehand? This is a really open research question. This is something that a lot of us are thinking about right now and trying to figure out, can reserves do that? Can just protecting us from fishing do that? And there are some examples where they can. So there's a really good example from kelp forests down in Southern California, which had the same problem that the kelp forests in Oregon did, which is they were really disrupted by the marine heat wave. It was too hot. There was not enough nutrients in the water. All the kelp died, or a lot of the kelp died. And we had lost these sea stars from the rocky reefs, right? So the sea stars that feed on the urchins meant that you now had lots and lots of little purple and red urchins running around, eating any kelp that tried to regrow. Well, in California, there are other things that eat sea urchins too. There are fish like the California sheephead, and there's California spiny lobsters that are also really important predators of urchins. And so it turned out that in some of these marine reserves down there, the lobsters and the sheephead were abundant in the reserves and very big. And so when the sea stars died back, there were still tons of urchin predators there. And so when the kelp was disturbed, the urchins didn't go crazy, the fish ate them all, and the kelp rebounded. And so the reserves did provide resilience. They made the kelp not drop as much, and they made the whole ecosystem come back faster. But that's an example from California. We don't have the same kind of food webs here in Oregon, right? We don't have fish that we fish for that are also urchin predators in the same way that we had in California. So it's unclear whether we get that kind of resilience out of Oregon's reserves as we might in other types of ecosystems. But there's good news. It does turn out that the other thing about having bigger populations and bigger fish is that they make more eggs. I see there's all these t-shirts I don't quite understand about I like big boss. But there's this idea, right, that bigger fish just make more eggs. And that means that if you protect a population from fishing, first of all, it's more resilient to the loss of a single cohort of individuals. So if 1 year all the juvenile fish die because there's some sort of hypoxic event that kills them all, then there's more older fish in the population. The population can kind of absorb the loss of that one event, and that's okay. But also, because you have more large fish, they'll be making more offspring, and they'll be growing back faster. And so the hope is that that would apply coast-wide as well, that if you have a lot of big fish locked away in a reserve, that they're making babies that could help reseed populations that are disturbed all along the coast. Okay. But this isn't a really active area of research because we're just now grappling with these sort of climate effects. And so our recommendation, again, was that ODFW should be thinking about how they can partner with other researchers, maybe like me, to think about how we can cultivate resilience inside marine reserves. Okay, so just to wrap up, I just wanted to summarize these recommendations we made, because I think this is where the conversation is going to be in the next year or so, as the legislature evaluates what to do with the Marine Reserves program. And so we recommended that we move forward with an adaptive management plan with these realistic goals. That requires monitoring these reserves and getting out in the water and seeing what's going on, but also monitoring coastal communities to find how coastal communities are responding to these reserves as they get older. We asked for clarity about how should we be measuring these potentially negative socioeconomic effects, or potentially positive, I should say. And we need to think more about this resilience idea, because moving forward, climate disturbances are going to be a bigger part of Oregon's coastal ocean, and we need to think about what that means for the reserves and what the reserves mean for that. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. White, for all the work that you and your team have done to assess the marine reserves here in Oregon. I would like to take a moment, bring up Joe Levazite from Portland Audubon, who will go around and introduce our wonderful community partners we have here tonight.
All right, let's give another round of applause for our two keynotes. We have a break coming up, but before you get out of your seats, I have a couple things. First, before I go around the room and introduce all of our partners and tablers, I just want you to, you have a little bit of homework, and we want some public participation here. We have a sign up here. It says, "What does adaptive management at Cape Perpetua mean to you?" So we have Post-its there. Please write what you think and put it there. Will White just gave a really great rundown of what adaptive management is, so hopefully you weren't sleeping during that part. So please come up and participate. We'd love to get your opinions. I know a lot of you in the audience here are biologists and economists, and also a lot of people that just live in this community, so please come up. And I'll go around the room. And first I want to say that I am one of the lucky ones that have been at this event 10 years in a row, so I'm really excited to see 10 years of success of the reserves. Okay. So let's start here on this side of the room, and during the time for you to mingle and eat, please stop by these tables. First, we have Surfrider from Newport chapter just up the road. Learn about some of the great work they're doing. Next table is Kelly Fuller, who I just met from Oregon Wild. She's new with Oregon Wild up in Depot Bay. Go and learn about all the great work they're doing in coastal forests and rivers. Next, View the Future, Joanne Cattell and her crew from right here in Yachats. We have not one but two tables by ODFW. We just heard Kristen talk about the great work over the past 10 years they've done. You can talk to the folks there in the back in the corner table about some of those products that they have. And then next right over is Jenny, who I just met, and she's the head of their Oregon Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia team, which climate change is a big issue, and it's happening, and we're really glad to see there's a program working on it. So she's got a report there that just came out a few months ago you can take a look at. Next table over is Rihanna with North Coast Land Conservancy, and she just got hired to work as our coordinator up at the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. So talk to her about our northernmost marine reserve. And next over we have the Mackenzie River Land Trust, Margaret and Holly over there to talk to you about a lot of the great land protection work they're doing in the area. And then over here we have the Audubon Corner with Kent Doty from Audubon Lincoln City. Check out the cool stickers. They have a sticker for every marine reserve. And they have a really excellent a scientific illustrator, Nora Sherwood, in their chapter that has these amazing artwork that's highlighted. We have Portland Audubon, my colleague Allison Anholt and Paul Englemeyer can learn more about birds there. And then finally, we have U.S. Forest Service and talk to them about, we have a really important partner here at the Cape Perpetua. We have the Cape Perpetua Collaborative Table, and we have Oregon State University Marine Studies Initiative Table. And finally, but last but not least, we have Jesse Jones with Oregon Conservation Coalition, Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, and Jessie does amazing work up and down the coast, and this is one of the places that she stops often. So thanks, and enjoy the food and drinks, and we'll meet back at 7:15, and please fill out some of those stickers. And there's also the cards on our chair are for questions for the panel discussion. Because the panel discussion, we're going to have some people that were originally here when the reserves were established back in 2012 that were part of the team of people that help advise on getting those reserves established. So come back for that great discussion. Thanks a lot.
All right, everybody. Thanks again so much for being here. Thanks to Bree getting us all back together. I would like to welcome up our panelists and also welcome Charlie Plyborn, who will be moderating this evening. So if our panelists could please come on up, pick a seat, any seat, and we'll introduce them all in a second. We do have shirts out there for you. They're yours to keep forever, and we can change out the sizes or the graphic if you want one in particular. It's the whole gang is back together. Bring them up. Yes. Hey, Paul, we're going to need ya. He's coming, of course. So I'd like to just take a moment to remind everybody about the note cards. So if you have a question, please just write your question down on a note card and put it up in the air, and one of us will come up and grab it and hand it to Charlie, the moderator, to ask our panelists.
All right. I'm Charlie Plyborn. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation. Thank you guys all for being here. I'm excited to host this panel. I am going to be introducing your panelists here to you. You guys have met Cristen and Dr. Will White, and then I'll go through the rest of the folks here. I'm actually just going to try and do my best to just read what's been written here, even though I know these folks and respect them very, very much and have a lot that I could say individually about them all, but I will just read what I've been told to say here. Paul Englemeyer's love of fishing and forests brought him to the Pacific Northwest in 1975. Over the years, Paul has been an advocate and champion for our seas and trees, focusing on habitat restoration, salmon recovery, and marble murrelet habitat protections. Paul also manages the nearby 10 Mile Creek Sanctuary for the Portland Audubon Society. In addition, Paul works closely with the Mid-Coast Watershed Council. Paul served on the Oregon Ocean Policy Advisory Council and helped with the development of the Marine Reserve System. Paul also helped form the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. He was one of the original members of the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve Community Team, and he's been instrumental in the collaborative's work and many things here in Yachats. Please welcome Paul Englemeyer. Down towards Will there we have Chrsity DeMoll. Chrsity is the owner and operator of Ocean Haven. I'm sorry. Once the owner and operator of Ocean Haven, a nature first lodging and naturalist guiding services for over 20 years. Among other advocacy platforms, she advocates for the protection of imperiled wildlife like whales and bears. Chrsity holds a BA from U of O and a Master's of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas in Austin. Please welcome Chrsity. Joe, another original member of the Cape Perpetua community team, has lived in the Waldport Yachats area since 1971. Joe Rohleder is, after graduating from University of Oregon and serving a tour of duty in the U.S. Army, he worked for the U.S. Siuslaw National Forest Service as an engineering geologist. Later, he ran a charter fishing boat from Siuslaw, Yachats, and Depot Bay harbors. I just read that. I saw that. I say Siuslaw, Yachats, and Depot. I don't think Yachats is a harbor per se. Yeah, so I'm gonna. I don't know. I apologize. It was the Newport. Stanislaw Newport in Depot Bay Harbors. He has spent many days fishing the coastal waters off of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and southeast Alaska. In 1986, he became a citizen lobbyist for sustainable fisheries. He later became a registered lobbyist representing recreational and commercial fisheries at the Oregon legislature. He was also a public at-large member of the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve Protected Area Working Group. He is currently retired and serves as the Port of Alsea Commissioner and a board member of the Mid-Coast Watershed Council. Please welcome Joe Rohleder. Jeff Feldner. Jeff Feldner is the first gentleman that I had the pleasure of talking to about fishing interest in the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. I was actually just reminiscing with him about rolling maps out in front of the Newells and the Ripkas and Alpazar in the library probably 15 years ago, maybe 16 years ago at HMSC, and showing them what the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve could look like for the first time, which was a difficult conversation. And I was glad to have Jeff there with me. Jeff lives in the Siletz Valley and was a commercial fisherman for over 40 years. Over the years, Jeff has served on ODF&W Commission and the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. That is no small duty, if anybody knows anything about what that council does. From 2006 to 2013, Jeff was employed by Oregon Sea Grant, where he represented Sea Grant during Oregon's Marine Reserve selection and development process, where he spent tireless time working with advocates like me and interfacing advocates like me with the fishing community and those opposed to marine reserves. Jeff is currently serving on the Fisheries Management Council and on the board of the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council. Please welcome Jeff. All right, so I'm going to just jump right in with a very non-controversial question, which is there any plans or are there any plans to increase the size of Oregon's marine reserves to reach the 30 by 30 goals? So who wants to take that question? Paul Englemeyer.
I have a little perspective about this that I'd so those of us that were on the original Marine Reserve, we didn't agree at the beginning, we didn't agree at the end completely, but none of us ever got to the point that we wouldn't talk to one another. And I think in today's political situation and society, we would have a horrible time doing anything to expand those marine reserves. And, you know, I have some ideas about some neat things to do, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. So, Jeff? Somebody else want to say something about that?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's never going to happen, but what I would say is that if there is the scientific conclusion that it would be good to expand them, we should use another very collaborative process to do it, involving fishermen and local people. What we did is an example of the right way to do it. We actually, I think we actually owe a certain favor to the state of California, because when they instituted their marine reserves, there was, even from what I heard from people down there, they did not listen very much to the local fishermen, and there was a lot of pain, it didn't work so well, and we did. So I think we can do it, but we're going to have to do it with that kind of a process.
Paul, do you want to say anything?
Sure. I guess the first thing was, how many of you know what 30 by 30 is? Okay, it's worth me explaining it a little bit. So there's a policy direction to protect 30% of our uplands, estuaries, and oceans by 2030. Okay, that's a vision. And so do you remember what Will said, and was it the 4th or 5th slide or recommendation? Adaptive management strategy. Okay, so what do we think we know? Well, there's an issue of connectivity that maybe the crowd knows about, maybe they don't, but it's real. If you talk to the scientists, there's probably about 30% of you in here that could say, I want to talk about connectivity. It's real. And if we design these things with adaptive approach, you would say to the fishermen, it's in our best interest to design a network, okay, where we protect a subset of the ocean, and that number that the scientific community has come up with is, ballpark is about 30%. If you believe the science, you'd say, you know what, we could do better than what we did, and I'm proud of what we've done. It was really hard and controversial. We'd have 200 people in a room showing the green fire production videos and introduce these concepts of BOFs. How many of you have heard of BOFs? Small percentage, not even half. Okay, so that's an example. There's a benefit. Everybody talks about the downside, but there's a benefit. And so if you're a seabird specialist, or if whales are your issue, or forage fish are your issues, guess what? If you protect a subset of the ocean, you will have benefits. So everyone acts like it's a big crisis, but there's a big gain. Maybe not for me and my generation, but for our grandkids. This is the agenda. Our vision is current conditions into the future. Think anybody was talking like this about sea otters 100 years ago? Or maybe oysters in our estuaries 100 years ago? No, no one was talking like this 100 years ago. So we've got the vision. 30 by 30 is a vision. So I can go on more and more on that, but there's an answer.
All right, Christy.
I'm not a fisherman, and I didn't eat fish until I moved to Oregon because I grew up where there were catfish. But I'm not going to speak for the fishermen here, but I had a business for 20 plus years that was ocean related. And I think one thing, like you said, we listened to the fishermen. We didn't listen. They told us what they needed. And I think that's something is tell the fishermen to think big. We kickstarted the funding for the marine reserves with leftover funds from the new Carissa that, crashed up just north of here. So the fishermen should tell us what they need to adapt to the ocean as it changes. And we find the money, the funding, the new type of boats, maybe not using diesel fuel, is just to think ahead and ask. We all are going to change. My business changed, their businesses change, and keep an economical perspective instead of a fear base of, I'm going to lose my boat, I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose this. And so try to keep out of the fear base and proceeding through the changes that we're all going to go through. So,
I do want to. The idea that the science tells us it's 30%, I want to push back a little bit on. I think that the science tells us that fish populations and marine reserves are connected, and there's all this connectivity for sure. And so any kind of policy action has to account for the fact that there's a mix of policy actions you can take. You can change the way we fish, you can change where you fish, you can change whether you have a reserve or not. The 30 by 30 movement came about as it's been a long evolution of a process that started back in the 1990s when the Convention on Biological Diversity was signed, and there had been a target set in 2010 to protect 10% of the ocean and lands and various things by 2020. And we've come close to hitting that target, but the idea was to be ambitious and say, well, okay, let's do 30% by 2030. And the 30% is really chosen because 2030 is kind of the next decade, right? It's an ambitious goal. I think I'd like, as a scientist who studies marine reserves, I'd like to convey that what we can tell you is these are policy decisions, right? What policy outcome do you want to have? And we can tell you what mix of different fishing practices or different marine reserve protections you could use to achieve that thing. But there's not necessarily a single answer for what the science says about how marine reserves should be or should be integrated into a fish seascape.
Make sure everybody caught that nuance.
One more little thing, Paul.
So this management decision and policy, he's exactly right. And so you can have a fishing technique and it be still open fishing, but you're not dragging on the ocean floor, you're not doing things. So that would be the equivalent of part of that 30% number. So that's a policy decision. So you're exactly right.
The question never ends, does it, guys?
You're the ones that invited us here. That question, I guess, does the 30 by 30 imply 30% of the overall near shore or 30% of rocky habitat? Because I think that's a critical question. 30% of rocky habitat, by all means. 30% overall, I don't know if that's going to have anywhere near the significant impact. So we need to be pretty careful about how we structure that 30.
Absolutely.
Yes, Jeff, you bring up a great point, which is there's a lot of nuance in 30 by 30. Will brought up, hey, marine reserves are a great tool, but what are we using them for? What's the policy question that we're trying, what's the tool gonna get us there for? And then 30 by 30, what does protected mean? Right? That depends on whose definition. So is that marine garden protected, or is it not protected because it's not a marine reserve? These are all kind of good questions, and they're still out there for us. Which leads me to my next question, though. Can somebody please tell me what the heck a BOF is? All right, so I'm gonna turn that over to the fisheries biologists. Big old fat fertile female is what we would say. And Will, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a colleague named Mark Carr, who's a professor down at UC Santa Cruz, and he loves acronyms, and he loves being very clever with acronyms. Back in the mid-2000s, some scientists at Oregon State discovered that some species of rockfish make the bigger females, which are also older females, make, I'm in air quotes here, better quality offspring. They made larvae that were a little bit bigger. I guess they're not really, juveniles that are a little bit bigger and survived a little bit better. And that idea then people got excited about that because that meant that maybe not only would marine reserves where you have fish living longer and getting older, maybe they would have these special fish that were like even more reproductive than your average female fish. And so that idea, somebody came up with this idea that we could have big old fecund female fish, so BOFF. And then Mark Hickson, who was a professor at Oregon State until a few years ago, decided that was not enough Fs. And so he wrote a paper that added 2 Fs, and so it's like big, old, fat, fecund female fish. And I'm not a fan of that acronym, and was actually very skeptical of this idea because it turns out that what happens with those rockfish, this is like black rockfish and a few other rockfishes, is that bigger, older females spawn their offspring earlier in the spawning season when the water's colder and conditions are rougher, and so those offspring have to be bigger to survive better. And the smaller females spawn later, and so they can put a wimpier offspring, and they do okay. That story makes sense from like an evolutionary theory point of view. There's no reason that older females should make better babies. They should just make more of the right amount kind of goodness of baby. But then it turns out my colleague in Australia, Dustin Marshall, compiled a lot of data and found out that across all fish, it is true that they don't necessarily make better offspring, but large fish do create disproportionately more offspring than you'd expect based on their size. So it's not just proportional to their biomass like we thought for a long time, but older, bigger fish do make just more babies, and so I'm forced to grapple with the BOF thing and teach it in my classes now.
And just to give everybody kind of an idea, like time-wise and discrepancy of young, how many babies are we talking about, and then how many years to maturity are we talking about for, let's just say, a more impressive BOF?
Oh gosh, I wasn't told there was going to be math. Sorry. Yeah.
Aren't you a mathematician?
I am, but like I've had a beer, So if we think about these rockfishes, some of them they typically mature in the the 8 to 10 year range, many of them, some of them a little bit longer. But then, of course, they can live for decades. And so the bulk of the reproduction happens many, many decades into their life. And in terms of how many offspring, I mean, this is like billions, right? And so the idea is that if you have, I'm trying to recall the paper, but the idea is that one very large female fish, so think of a big, one of these big deep water rockfishes, if you had the same biomass, the same weight of other smaller fish. So if you're just thinking about how many pounds of mature rockfish are we talking about, that one female will make like 1.5 times more babies than the equivalent weight of others. So it's quite a lot when you add it up over many, many, many years that they're reproducing if they're spawning every single year. So it's not insubstantial. Of the offspring? Not averaged over the whole season, no, to my knowledge. They're not superficial, a lot more of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the message is it's a numbers game. Yeah. And in species that have an old age class structure and in temperate ecosystems, it takes long times, as we've learned, to measure those changes. I'm going to move us to the next question. This is, of course. All right. The night would not have been the same without this comment, so I'm going to.
So you were almost there on the whole story, but the research that you guys have done is spectacular. And this is how valuable what you're doing is, okay? That's my take. So Berkeley, there's this team at the Marine Science Center that they raise this flag and says, hey, guess what? There are very fecund fish out there. He didn't quite say, but 1.7 million offspring. Did everybody catch that? It's one fish. Okay, so then they're long-lived. They're long-lived. 100 years? 200 years? Yes, that's how long they lived. And then you ask the scientists, why would this happen? This is the key point. The scientist says, guess what? There's this decadal oscillation that goes like this. He knows it, the scientific community. We had Bill Piercy up here talking about that about 4 years ago, Dr. Piercy. So you got this decadal oscillation. They're throwing this offspring out, the beginning, the peak, and the end. 1.5 to 2 million offspring a year by that BOF, okay? And ocean conditions are poor. The roll of the dice, sorry, you don't survive. The roll of the dice, you have a good year. That's why they live long, and that's why they're very productive. And that's why we should protect them. A subset.
All right. Well said, Paul. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. All right. I'm going to send this one to Cristen, I think. And then I'll bring it back to you, Paul. Cristen gets first crack because she was in charge of the science for some time with her team. And I wanted to get, how important is shore-based community citizen science in the long-term monitoring and engagement to marine reserves? So I'm going to start with you, Cristen, and then you'll get a crack, Paul.
Well, I would just say community science projects are, I think, important for the number one reason of just getting more people engaged, and it gets them involved and educated, and they help also spread the word about what the research is saying, what's going on. So there's a value, even regardless of the science, just a social value to community-based science. we haven't done a whole lot of shoreside-based community science. There has been some intertidal stuff. Most of our program is with the hook and line sampling. We have recreational anglers come out with us, and that's been a hugely successful program. It was modeled off a similar program in California, and these are knowledgeable anglers who come out year after year after year, and they are spokespeople for our program. I mean, and not all of them necessarily agree with marine reserves or think, that's like the right tool to be using, but they are dedicated to the science and great spokespeople for ocean science in general. I can't speak as much to the shore side, like shore-based, if I'm understanding the question correctly about, yeah. So Paul, you've been engaged with a lot more of.
I'm going to take it.
Okay.
Before
All
he
right.
gets it. Okay. Okay. I just want to do a shout out to Jessie Jones, if she's still here, with Coast Watch, which is one of the most incredible programs in the world, really, where each mile of the Oregon coast has at least one volunteer who monitors it. And sometimes the monitoring comes from a initiative, like maybe if you happen to be in a marine reserves, and other times it's self-perpetuated, or they get a request. Can you start collaborate with the Sea Star wasting? But they do trainings, so they have educations, and they do monitoring and reports, and that's just a huge database going back. How many years? I can't remember when I first started with the Coast Watch program, but and that has been very successful, but they kind of didn't know what to do with the information they were gathering until Sea Grant got involved, and then when Kirsten started doing her offshore things, it gives people ideas where they can expand. But so if anyone's interested in volunteering, they were doing a training here on the King Tides today, and tomorrow I think they'll be out in the photographing the King Tide project. So, Paul.
I have a little on why. Hold it here. Oh, okay. Well, this technology. I'm just an old fisherman. I somehow ended up doing a lot of lobbying at the Oregon legislature, and what I did more than anything else was I worked with the Ways and Means Committee to make sure that these guys had enough money to do the job that they need to do. Now, you're never going to be able to complete it, but the best tool that I had to lobby legislators to give these guys money was citizens that came in and told their story. Why are you a fisherman? How do you feel about climate change? How does that affect your everyday life? You go in and tell folks that are legislators, like Representative Gomberg, about your personal involvement and why these things are important, then you get those things. It's like, at about 5 years into the Marine Reserve program, ODF&W is having some real trouble with license sales and some other things. And we got together a group of people that came in and talked about why we needed enforcement, and we got $10 million of general fund just for enforcement for these marine reserves. And at the same time, I don't know how many times legislators would talk to me about, well, why do you really need this? And we had people that would come out of the community, like you all, and talk to legislators about why we needed that money.
Community science has been one of my projects for 15 to 20 years. And so we didn't really hear anything about seabirds and the value of marine reserves to seabirds. Guess what? It's real. There's a huge value. The species that's near and dear to my heart is that little seabird called the marbled murrelet. The bummer is you hardly ever see them. Even good birders, it's hard to see. They live on the ocean 98% of their life, fly in the dark into the old growth forest. You hardly ever see them. but we do these community science things. Have been doing it for almost 20 years. And so, in dealing with that one particular species that's linked to the health of the ocean as well as the health of the forest. So we get engaged community members dealing with monitoring, turning them on to this unique species, just like we do the BioBlitz effort. How many of you have heard of the BioBlitzes we've been doing? Raise your hand. Wow, that's great. You realize that we have about, around the world, there is 20 million people that are doing the same thing, just like us, community scientists that are gathering data for climate change and species distribution. So these are amazing things that you only protect what you love. Fishermen already love the ocean. They want to get on the water as much as they can. That's not a question mark. And they're pros at catching fish. Marine reserves, marine protected areas, community science are all pieces of a strategy to help move community endorsement of this to protect something for the future generation. That's what we're doing. Community science is a piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, everyone. That was awesome. I want to ask a question of Jeff, who was kind of hired as a fixer, if you will. It's the truth, and I'll take you guys back like years ago to like when the Marine Reserve. How many of you guys were around when the Marine Reserves were just being discussed as an idea? Because not a lot of you know, like that it literally took 10 years. It took a decade. 10 years for that idea to actually come to a fruition of actually really designating things. 10 years of whether or not we could agree on this, and largely there was division on the coast. And one group and one entity that was very well trusted at the time, and it still is very much trusted, a very good broker of science and policy and community engagement, is Oregon Sea Grant. Oregon Sea Grant does this very, very well, and I'm very proud of the work that they do. I sit on their advisory committee. Recognize Karina, who's their new executive director, is here today. Thank you for coming over here and making it. But they hired, or Jeff was already on Sea Grant, but they contracted with Sea Grant to say, you know what, you need to work with ODF&W and help set up some community teams of people that all have some sort of a stakehold in these areas, and y'all need to roll up your sleeves and work it out. Figure out like less than 10, no more than 10, less than that 10 or whatever, and then these broad sort of guidelines. Do no harm, do no socioeconomic, protect biodiversity, make everybody happy, right? So Jeff has to do this, and like thinking back to that time, it was hard. It was really, really hard work. It was the cover of every headline on the coast. It was a lot of controversy. That does not really exist today. In fact, that tension, there's still some tensions with marine reserves, but a lot of that, it's not even palpable compared to what it was then. And so what I'd like to do is kind of go back there and then move forward and say, Jeff, if you could do it all over again, if you go back and start that process differently, if it was you, because you got thrown in the fire and you make good work of it, my friend. But I'd like to hear a little bit about if you could do it differently. What would that look like? And maybe we'll hear from some of the other folks too.
If you could do it differently. Well, obviously the first thing would have been started 10 years earlier, but 10 years earlier you probably wouldn't have gotten me to be involved either. I think we'll be looking at this again as we look at the possibility of expanding these areas. And I think that's an excellent way to go about it. But I think the only appropriate way to go about it is going to be something similar to the process that we used to get what we have now, the marine reserves, that we have now. And you'll need to do, again, another round of basically educating the communities about what this means. And again, going back to the thing about going up to 30%, it's important to just not use the overall 30% because people are going to look out their windows and say, what do you mean, like 1/3 of all the ocean I see is going to have a fence around it? you want to make sure that it's 30% of the areas that are already productive for the kinds of species that you expect to show improvement by reserving some of the area. And the only way to do this is basically, again, a community bottom-up structure, and it can happen. The good thing about coastal communities, and particularly the fishing community, is that they are knowledgeable. They do understand it. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd see already some of the guys that would shake their head and say, yeah, we're seeing impacts already, even though 10 years is a speck of time in what we're going to need to actually get a measurement of this. It's going to be more like 30 years before we're really going to see it. So encourage them to be patient, bring them in, but bring them in a process kind of similar to what we used.
Jeff ran it the first time, so he's kind of like, don't mess with perfection. I'm going to let his wife say something now because she had to live with it.
I just want to add the words listening and learning. That's what it was. It was a listening and learning tour of the Oregon coast.
That was the turning point.
It was listening and learning.
Because it was imploding again.
And
So Sea Grant did a tour to try and just add on to that for folks that weren't around. But there was a point when the Marine Reserve process got so contentious, and like I said, they brought Sea Grant and Jeff on, and Jenny Goldberg at the time, brought her out of retirement. You know you're made it when they bring you out of retirement, and Tommy, and yeah, they brought them in to be the fixers, and the first thing that Sea Grant identified that they needed to do was a listening and learning tour. They said, hey, everybody's talking to the coast about marine reserves and telling them what the reasons are. We need to go out and listen to them, and we need to hear what they think, and then we'll readdress this. And you're right, that was a turning point. Not everybody liked what they heard on that listening and learning session, me included. I don't even think Paul necessarily liked everything we heard, but we learned how to work with different people and learned how to reach mutual goals and things. So, all right. Anybody else want to add to how they would do things any differently?
I've always got a perspective.
I know you do. Do people want to hear Paul's perspective? Yeah, they do.
So I was on the Ocean Policy Advisory Council representing the conservation community. And there was, of course, commercial recreation agencies. Within that process, we moved forward with the concept of, we're not all pros, but you know what? We know some scientists. Why don't we establish a scientific technical advisory committee to help move the dialogue forward using the best available? It was one of the greatest ideas that we all had. That came to reality. That same group said, you know what? Why don't we do a workshop? Let's go down to Institute of Marine Biology, Coos Bay, and let's have was it a 2 or 3 day? At least 2 days. 2 days, really fun, bunch of scientists talking fish. It's really cool. Yeah, and fish. It was everybody there. It was really good. And so out of that came a document, size and spacing document. It's like one of the best products that I think we produced. And we mostly used the document. What would I do different? I would use the document.
Mic drop.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that one stung for some people that aren't here probably. So I'm going to ask the next question, which is there any sort of space for blue carbon research consideration at the marine reserves? So I'm going to walk that one down to Dr. White here. I know. You can pass the mic.
Yeah, so blue carbon's, people know what blue carbon is? Okay, so the idea is that we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've got to pull it out of the atmosphere. Maybe we could pull it out of the atmosphere and have it be in the ocean, and then it's not in the atmosphere and things cool down a little bit. The trick with blue carbon is that the carbon has to go away. so that we can't get it back into the atmosphere. It has to be locked away some way. So on land, right, we think about planting forests and planting grasslands with really deep roots so that that carbon gets sequestered deep in those roots, it gets translocated into the soil, and it stays there, doesn't get in the atmosphere. So blue carbon in the ocean, it can work, but it can only work if there's a process for the carbon coming out of the air into the water. So algae and phytoplankton are constantly photosynthesizing and pulling that carbon dioxide out of the air into their bodies, right? But then that stuff has to sink and has to go down to the bottom of the ocean and get locked away in sediments so that it doesn't come back up. And so we have really productive nearshore ecosystems in Oregon, but to say that they're productive means that those little phytoplankton and the algae get eaten by stuff. And then those animals are breathing and they're getting eaten by things and they're pooping. And all of that carbon that the phytoplankton pulled out of the air so helpfully just goes right back into the air. And so there has to be ways to lock things away. And the best ways to have blue carbon, studies have shown, are in things like coastal marshes, estuaries. We don't have mangroves here, but mangroves are really good at that. Because those things have sediments where the carbon can be photosynthesized, pulled into sediments, and then locked away in these anoxic sediments, right? You know, you go to the marsh and you smell that marsh smell, right? That's the smell of that's the smell of things that are dead and weren't exposed to oxygen. And so that carbon dioxide wasn't re-released into the atmosphere. So those marsh sediments are really important. There's some interest in the idea of whether things like kelp forests could be part of a blue carbon solution, but the problem with kelp is it doesn't grow in soil. And so you only get kelp turning into blue carbon if the kelp gets sort of ripped out of the kelp forest and somehow conveyed to the deep sea, which doesn't happen very frequently. So really it is all about estuaries and these nearshore sediment ecosystems.
I have heard that there's substantial carbon sequestration in deep sea bottom habitat, non-trawled habitat, which might lend itself to one type of marine protected area and carbon sequestration. I'm no scientist. I just read papers and stuff, though, so I'll take Will's advice there. All right, so next question. In regard to monitoring, how have advances in capabilities and technology impacted these sort of long-term studies on a spatial scale? Actually, that's a great question. So maybe when you think about satellites and all the other remote ways of studying our oceans. Is this one another Dr. Will White, I believe, is going to start there? And we'll work our way down. I know Cristen has some experience here, too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the science of monitoring marine reserves was mostly developed in places where it's much easier to go scuba diving than it is in Oregon. And so, yeah, absolutely. A lot of the innovations that ODFW has really advanced with using remotely operated underwater vehicles, so basically, robots that we send down with cameras to take pictures, what we call video landers. So you put a camera on a big weighted platform and drop it off the boat and it sinks to the bottom, and then you can take pictures of the fish that are around there without having to physically go down there. This is also really important for places where it's too deep to go scuba diving anyway, right? We can only go down safely to about 100 feet or so, and there's a lot of habitat that's deeper than that. So those types of tools have been really important and formed a lot of the data that were in the report. There's also a lot of interest in what we call remote sensing, so using satellites and drones and that sort of information. That's really important stuff for monitoring sort of large-scale ocean patterns of temperature and currents and where I was getting the kelp, yeah. And this is a really active area of research because it turns out the hardest part of the ocean to observe in those ways is right up against the coastline, because if you have a satellite that's pointing partly at the ocean and partly at the land, the oceanographers are like, what if we just forget about that? That's hard to deal with. And so it's a growing science of how to get these really, really close to the beach estimates of what's going on in the ocean from up in space. And so that's all these things are things that ODFW has spent 10 years really nailing down, I think, and dialing in for observing in Oregon.
We do need to know ROV, though. Our ROV is coming of age. So that's technology does die out, and then it's expensive to replace with the latest, greatest. So investing in those. But kelp, definitely for canopy forming kelp, satellite images are, or area, like low flying drones, thank you, brains, are being used currently, actually, first time in Oregon. It's been over a decade since we've done a coast-wide kelp survey, so that's extremely important. So I think technology will just keep expanding and becomes more affordable as it goes on. And I think taking advantage of these tools is absolutely necessary and the way to go. So.
My colleague Francis Chan would be mad at me if I didn't also mention moorings, right? So we have a lot of instruments that are physically out in the ocean measuring things like oxygen levels that are really important in these areas.
As long as we're bringing up other people, we should pass it.
And advancements in batteries then allow them to leave those moorings out longer. And
There's another piece of the story here. It isn't all fish. And so we've got species that have come from the South Pacific, and we didn't know that until the technology got good enough to attach a radio on the top of an albatross. And then they let them fly, and you could sit in the office and say they left on Wednesday, and they're still flying north and east towards us, right offshore there 30 miles to go back and feed their chick in the South Pacific atolls. So these are albatross, and the technology has now blossomed to that level. It's a great book called Eye of the Albatross by Dr. Carl Safina. Blow you away.
Okay, I think we have time for probably one more question. Two. I'm going to answer one of them really fast because I think we can answer it. How much enforcement actually occurs in the marine reserves? And I actually will let Cristen quickly answer that one because I think it's a good point for Oregon, contrasting it to maybe some other places.
yeah, so Oregon State Police does record hours that they spend actually actively monitoring. I can't remember off the top of my head. It is in the report in the appendices. But they also, citizens, especially fishermen, reporting activity they think is illegal has been a huge help. Huge. And so it's citizen scientists working with Oregon State Police, and we've had a very high compliance rate so far also, particularly with commercial fishermen, so yeah.
I think the compliance rate's well over 90%. That's like way up in the high percentage. All right, so I want to end with something kind of uplifting and see if we can't get through everybody quickly here on this one. And just, what are you most proud about over the last 10 years? This is a big thing for Oregon. It took us a long time to get here. In the last 10 years, what are you most proud about for the Oregon Marine Reserves program? Paul, I'm going to let you have the last word, buddy.
Thanks. Well, I'm excited about the science. So I'm a newcomer to Oregon. I've been here for only 5 years. So I was in California when the design process started, and I sort of gave some advice to that. But as a scientist, I've been really excited to see the way the Oregon Reserve System has contributed to the development of marine reserve science and the opportunities to think about how do they work, how do they interact with fisheries, do they provide climate resilience, what do they do for kelp forests, and what do they do for hypoxia and crabs and all these things. So the opportunities to do really great science have been a huge thing.
Well, just seeing the development of the citizen science program and that we actually got funded and staffed. And I mean, to me, that was a big negative. People say, oh, we'll never get the money. Well, we did, and it's only expanded. So that's very exciting. It's also had an impact on other people looking in to see how they could develop Oregon shores, and that is like at the same time, I mean, this is controversial, but we were dealing with the Navy wanting to use sonar, and in their environmental impact statement actually said they wanted to protect Oregon from pirates. I mean, it's in the federal law. And so we've been able to be pirate-free, pretty much, without the naval sonar. And that's something I never thought the Marine Reserves would help, but it scared them off for at least now 10 years. They may be back, but
No tigers either.
Yeah.
I'm definitely most proud of the interdisciplinary work that is done. I mean, that's what I've always loved about marine protected areas. I mean, I think they're great for their conservation benefits, but the fact that you force everyone from different disciplines to come together to manage an area holistically, and I mean everyone, right? From Jeff, the fisherman, to Christy, the local business owner, we all had to come together. We have a human dimensions research program. We have ecological monitoring. We had science communication staff. We have these amazing local marine community groups who've just spun off and done the most amazing things well above and beyond what the agency would be able to do by themselves. So to that, the momentum is exciting, and the interdisciplinary nature, I think, is pretty groundbreaking and awesome.
I think you've already said pretty much all of it. I would agree pretty much with the term science, but I wouldn't restrict it to science. I would more think of it as the acceptance of science by our community, including the community of fishermen.
So I think from my point, the thing that I'm proudest of is that at the time, I don't think any of us really thought it was really going to ever be a big thing, that marine reserves were just going to kind of be a step that we had to make to move on to the next step, whatever that was. But just today, this thing here, this encourages me that there's a lot of young people, and there's some people here that are old, even some people that are almost as old as me, and we're all really enthusiastic about this. And we think about marine reserves and how they might make a difference in climate change, and how they might keep us fishing. And I just think that's really incredible that we're still at it, and that you all are interested.
Thank you, Joe. Really good. Awesome. Hey, so I guess my take on it is, what am I proud of? You know, there's a map of the world with research that's going on around the world for biodiversity, marine reserves and biodiversity. If you haven't seen it, I've got it, okay? And so when that map was created, we had a gap, nothing in Oregon. We now have a place on the map. We're part of a worldwide effort to understand and hopefully protect marine biodiversity for current and future generations. That's goal 19 if you don't know. We have statewide planning goals, and I get to go back and touch that base all the time. Will this move us in the direction of protecting and restoring? And the answer is, this project will. And if we study it correctly, it'll tell a good story. I may not be around, but maybe your grandkids will be around, and they'll say, I'm glad what these guys did. That's what I'm proud of. I'm a part of something.
All right, big round of applause for our panel. Yeah, Katie, you want to come on back up here? Again, thank you guys all for being here. Before you go, I think Katie has something for you all. I have a lot of respect for all of you, and so does the collaborative. And I'm going to turn it back over to Katie here to present you with your gifts this evening.
Thank you all so much for being here. This was such an informative conversation. Raise your hand if you learned something. Yeah, for sure. So thank you all so much. Would you do us a kind favor? Hold those shirts up and we can take a photo with you. Will, we won't give you a BOF one if you don't want it. Yeah, big round of applause for them. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. And don't run away just yet. We have a few more things this evening, and there's more food. Yeah, Boone wants to say there's more food. Can we all say thank you to Boone?
Call me. I do weddings, personal chef stuff. Call me. It's fun. Anyway, Mandala Catering.
Mandala Catering for Boone Ogden. I do have a gift that I'd like to present to outstanding partner of ours, Drew Rosland, who we're giving him this Outstanding Business Partner Award from the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. His support for us has been significant and ongoing, and he's just absolutely wonderful. We're so grateful for his support. If you don't know that name, he's the owner of the Overleaf Lodge and the Fireside, and he has a wonderful program where it's an opt-out donation where each stay he adds on $1, and that $1 goes to us. And we're so thankful. It's an absolutely tremendous support. So we'd like to present this award to him. He's currently in Arizona visiting his daughter. However, he has sent Brad Webb to come up and collect this award. Brad, could you please come up? Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yeah, we'll look at me right there. Thank you.
I would also, before we totally close out for the evening, I'd like to recognize our volunteers. We have several of them in this room tonight, and they're absolutely wonderful. We couldn't do anything that we do at Cape Perpetua Collaborative without them. Could you stand up if you're a volunteer with us? And we're always looking for more volunteers. Contact us. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to Newport News Times back there. They brought all the audio and video and everything. They're going to make a video of this event. So thank you all so much for being here. We're totally stoked to have you. You're welcome, Casey. He told me to say stoked. So to wrap up our evening, we do have one short video to share. And, there's more food, there's more drink. Please mingle more at the tables before you head out. We have the space till 8:30, and then we're kicking you out. But we're going to enjoy this video in just a moment. And again, thank you all so, so much for being here. There's just so many resources and staff time and volunteer hours that go into planning this event, and we just thank you all so much for your support of the collaborative. We are kicking off a strategic planning process tomorrow. So, if you have anything that you'd like to say to us, tell us now, and it's all about how we can grow and expand our outreach and our volunteer programs. And, if you've enjoyed yourself tonight, please consider volunteering or making a donation, either in our donation box we have out there or online at any point on our website. And, but overall, what we really hope is that you feel inspired by all the accomplishments of the Marine Reserves in Oregon and want to continue supporting the Marine Reserves into the future. So if we've heard one theme tonight, I think it's always remember to stay active and communicate your voice and your support for Oregon's Marine Reserves with your elected officials so that we can continue getting the support into the future. So with that, please enjoy this video produced by the Nature Conservancy.
After 10 years, we have learned Oregon's marine reserves do more than expected. They do more than protect. They produce. They do more than educate. They drive discovery. They do more than preserve nature. They let people play. They do more than conserve biodiversity. They create opportunity. Our marine reserves give us a more productive Oregon coast for marine life and coastal communities. Oregon Marine Reserves do more.